podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies, advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Helena Clayton, and in this 6-part series, we're exploring love in coaching. With 25 years of working in leadership and organisational development, for the last 8 years, I've been researching, writing about, and running leadership programs and workshops exploring the role of love in leadership, in work, and beyond. And for this series, I brought together 6 amazing coaches as my guests, all of whom are strong advocates and pioneers in what they do, and how they think about and integrate love into their coaching. 3 of them are writing books about love. 1 has just submitted their master's thesis about love, and another talks so boldly about love to their international and very senior leadership audiences that it takes my breath away. So thank you for being here and for bringing your curiosity to this thought-provoking series at a time when the world needs love more than ever. So yes, here is the conversation between Amy and me. Welcome, Amy. Hello. So good to be here with you today.
Wonderful to see you, Helena, and delight to be here.
Amy and I have spoken before through a shared commitment to, as well as interest in, love in organisations and the corporate world and way beyond. We've not met, but I hear there's a rumour Amy may be in the UK later this year, so maybe I'll see what's possible there. But rarely, if ever, have I heard anybody speak so clearly and with such conviction about things that don't ordinarily get spoken about in organisational life and in the corporate world. Yes, in organisations we are maybe hearing more now about trauma, and that is a word that's being used more, but we very rarely hear named and talked about and advocated for spirituality in organisational life, love in leadership and in the corporate world, or healing and how organisations could or arguably should be places of healing. So when I say that, it's no surprise why I wanted to speak to Amy as part of this conversation exploring coaching and love. So again, Amy, big welcome. And I wonder, would you tell folks, who are you? What is it you do?
Thank you for that invitation. For the last 20 years, I'm in year 20, I've been the co-founder and CEO of a leadership development firm called Mobius Executive Leadership, which I created with my sister, Erica Ariel Fox, who's a longtime lecturer at Harvard Law School, to exactly, as you said, introduce psycho-spiritual development and healing into the world of business. I've had the enormous privilege of conducting immersive healing workshops for senior leaders from around the world for the last 20 years on a pretty regular basis. And as you alluded to, Helena, I've really come to a strong conviction that the level of emotional immaturity and regression from which most leaders are operating is a sort of invisible pandemic that is the ceiling on how high-performing a team can be, on how much of a contribution to the social good a company can make, on the cultural architecture of society, that those trauma aftermaths are shaping so much of the architecture and cartography of the world that we live in, that those of us that have the privilege to counsel and guide leaders who affect thousands of lives have, I think, a moral obligation and a sort of collective imperative to provide context in which people can turn their attention back towards their inner life, from which many of them are quite estranged and alienated, can go and reclaim and integrate earlier seminal events in their childhood for the purpose not only of healing, but of alchemical transformation and liberation, and can then be freed up to lead from their highest vision and highest possibility. So my work has been introducing into the world of organizational intervention and leadership development, vertical development, we might say, qualities of love and compassion and emotional and spiritual maturity as part of the inherent development journey of executives. And that's me in a nutshell.
Lovely. Thank you. And I know we'll dive into what some of the practice of this might look like. And interesting, my first question was going to be something else, but I do want to pick up on your use of language. There's a depth and a poeticness about the way you speak. And I'm curious. I know that when I speak about love in organizations, it can often get a reaction. What do you notice and what have you experienced? And is this changing in people who listen to you say what you've just said here?
First of all, thank you for the reflection. That's very generous. I think that those of us who are pushing the cutting edge of this conversation that you and I are so passionate about, one of our mandates in order to be bringing this to the world of business, which has not been so historically receptive to doing that deep inner work or to having that kind of trauma lens on organizational dynamics, is to be able to craft a language that is a bridge language. So I don't go to clients and talk about the urgency of trauma treatment. I go to clients and say, are you seeing dysfunctional behaviors in your team dynamics? Are you seeing a cap on how innovative and creative and audacious people are being? Are people having the most important conversations candidly and productively inside of senior teams, or are they happening at the water cooler through gossip and factionalization? You can tie almost anything that we might describe as a transformational imperative now into very concrete business urgency. As things become more complex, more chaotic, the level of fear goes up, the level of ambiguity goes up, the level of unpredictability goes up, and people are struggling with all of that actively. That's something organizations recognize as an urgent need. And so if you can, for example, rather than talking about lowering the level of fear inside of a senior leader or a team relationships, you could talk about psychological safety and its close connection to the capacity to innovate and make change. Instead of talking about intimacy, you could talk about what does it take to create a higher degree of productive disequilibrium, that people have the inner fluidity and cognitive agility to sense make and iterate and experiment and learn. So a lot of this can be closely tied to pillars around becoming what Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy would call a deliberately developmental organization. And I think most CHROs that I speak with understand that they're at the breaking point of being able to help people manage the level of chaos that they're being faced with and the level of demand for change agility. And that gives us, I think, a very unique moment in time where all of a sudden these, quote, softer skills become a business imperative. But what you're pointing to, Helena, I think is a critical aspect of the skillful means of introducing some of this psychological content into the world of business, which is attending to the lexicon we're using to describe it and being willing to cross-model translate between the worlds of psychology, mythology, philosophy, perennial wisdom, spirituality into the world of commerce successfully. That's one part of it. I think the second part of it, for me anyway, and I spend a huge amount of time with practitioners in the global community of practice I have the privilege to lead, talking about what are the qualities you're transmitting into the room. Because I believe that our open-heartedness, or the depths through which we've traveled, the terrain we've traveled in our own inner life, become a walking invitation to someone else's willingness to explore themselves. And that's way beyond language. You pointed to it as poetry. I think of it as frequency. But regardless, it's what's the quality of your presence inviting. And one of the things that I purposefully do is to speak from my depths. And I think that my willingness or my practice or refinement to do that normalizes the possibility that the conversation could happen at deeper levels of intimacy than it normally happens. The other thing I do always on day one of a program is to make quite explicit the social contract through which most business is being conducted, which is we're going to operate behind a shield. We're going to speak in very routinized, habitual ways. We're not going to reveal our emotional terrain to ourselves or to others. And we're going to hack our emotional experience by numbing practices. And when you ask a group of leaders, what's the cost of that shield or that wall, they're very able to point to the immediacy of their own personal costs. They're more lonely, they're more isolated, they're more scared, they don't ask for help, they don't even have a vocabulary of relational requests. And then if you ask them to double click further on the cost of that to the business, they're able to say, we're operating in silos, we don't operate as a team, we don't have a sense of generosity and solidarity to support each other when we get stuck, it's hard to ask for help, it's challenging when we fail, to admit that we failed and learn, all the things that lower the quality of connective tissue inside the organization. And once that's quite explicit, then you have a lot of permission to really help slowly and systematically invite people to explore who they are.
Yeah, I love that phrase. What does my presence invite? Thank you. That's beautiful. I always say that these conversations, there are many gifts for me. That's one already. That's a beautiful question. I'm also thinking that I'm hearing you say that in order to support people to explore their depths, depths, whatever that might be, the coach needs to have gone there. So for you to speak to people from your depth, you need to have done your own deep inner healing growth work. So for coaches listening who are interested in what that depth work might be, so they can deepen their presence, connect with more love, perhaps in this case, what is that territory? What is the depth work that coaches really need to consider?
That's a beautiful question, and it's one very close to my heart. In addition to creating Mobius, Eric and I also created a professional development arm called the Next Practice Institute, whose purpose is to provide a deep container for practitioners to do exactly what you're saying, to take an inner walk that refines them, matures them, expands them, and cultivates the quality of presence that we're speaking about. So maybe I'll bucket into a few categories. I think the first category is psychological. I think it's important that people have done their own therapeutic work, done it in a longitudinal and dyadic therapy so that the relationship with the therapist has a chance to replay and reveal the psychodynamics of early childhood that become our relational footprint, so we can become more conscious of our unconscious relational dynamics and not simply import those into the coaching relationship. There's lots of different forms of psychological work, of course, but just to name a few, there's psychodrama, there's narrative therapy, there's existential psychoanalytic psychotherapy, there's relational work, there's internal family systems, there's Gestalt work, there's transactional analysis. Any of those disciplines can be a window or a tributary of self-exploration. I think the most important part is to find a therapist that you trust to confront your blind spots and to allow the therapy to point you where you don't ordinarily look. And that's a vulnerable thing to grant somebody the authority to guide you like that, but I don't think there's any way to avoid that kind of polishing if relationship is then going to be your craft. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that many of us, because we had different challenges in our childhood, grow up in a quite dissociated survival pattern that leaves us disembodied and emotionally walled off. And so doing practices like body work, breath work, martial arts, dance, hands-on healing, Reiki, any of those practices that help you to become more embodied and somatically alive. Of course, raise your level of vitality and vibrancy and therefore the potency of the interventions you make. But it also helps you come home to yourself at a whole other level. And I think that's a really important dimension of the path. And the third one is the one you mentioned earlier, Helena, which is how do I open the portal of my connection to something higher and the inspiration of being in communion with a higher power. And that could happen through 12-step recovery programs, through religious practice, through studying with a spiritual teacher or taking personal mastery workshops or doing various Buddhist and meditative and contemplative practices or attending rituals that are about honoring nature and honoring cycles and honoring life transitions. There's many ways to open the portal of spiritual aliveness, but I think being a beacon of hope and possibility and faith in contexts that are often cynical and shut down and self-protective, that's also part of the way that we're homeopathic to corporate life. So I think whatever it is that seasons you to have a sense of the aesthetics and eros and sensuality and beauty on the one hand, which is an important unlock for the world of intuition and imagination and creativity, and also a really genuine open heart to have really expanded the reach of your unconditional love and your ability to receive someone's hurt parts and fragmented parts and offer them a cradle or a sanctuary. That's what I think the spiritual dimension gives us as practitioners.
Lovely, thank you. And if I attend to that work in that way, a little or a lot, how does that help me connect with love? What's the connection with working with love or being loving? How does that help us connect with love?
I think my fundamental premise, Helena, is that you can't accompany anyone into the terrain you haven't explored in yourself. So any facet of your own psyche that you haven't embraced with unconditional acceptance, you can't offer that embrace to others. So if, for example, you have a lot of shame and you haven't done the inner child work to hold the parts that are self-critical, then you're not going to be able to intervene in somebody else's inner critic. If you're walking around with a lot of rage and you haven't been able to come to terms with your anger, you're not going to be able to coach somebody about how to hold their own reactivity. Those are just concrete examples. But the terrain that you've embraced lovingly in yourself is exactly what you then transmit to others, is acceptable, and you're a walking blessing field for those parts in other people. And the wider the unity inside you, the wider the unity you can see in the world. So you become less and less polarized or fragmented inside yourself. Then you bring that wholeness as a field of possibility to the leaders that you coach. How would you have answered that question?
Yeah, I love the question, what do we mean by love? Because I don't flipping know. It's like, how could I possibly take a stab at that? But I think where I've come to is that love is expansion in some way. Something about going deeper, going wider, going higher. So something about the more I can expand my ways of seeing something, my ways of responding, understanding. Bert Hellinger in Systemic Constellation says love is a wide-angled lens. So the more I can bring some version of a wide-angled lens to something, for me, the more loving I can be, or the more of my love I can draw on or reach into, something like that. I think so much of the practices, they're way more than practices, that you've mentioned there and outlined, give me some form of expansion, I think.
I love wider, deeper, higher. That's gorgeous cartography. My teacher, Thomas Hubel, talks about the importance of recognizing that whatever shows up now in adult life as dysfunctional or disharmonious, or what we would call in coaching derailers, is a childhood survival strategy that once upon a time was the most brilliant self-protective adaptation that was possible, but that's past its due date. It's sell by date. It's an antiquated survival strategy that's now being imported from childhood into a new context where it doesn't belong and it's not so helpful. But if we as coaches go in and perceive it as a derailer, we actually can't be that field of unconditional love in which it has the possibility to repair. We have to go in and honor and bow to the brilliance of that behavior in the earlier context before it will unwind and acquiesce to something that's more liberated or has more fluidity. So that importance of suspending the impulse for assessment, I think, is part of the quality of love that you're pointing at. I did a meditation spontaneously last week with a group of executives in which I created something called the heart dial. And I was teaching them how to tap into different facets of love and what they would look like, to feel them, where they would live in their body, what it would be like to express them. I'll just give you a couple illustrative examples because I was trying to answer the question you just pointed to, Helena. What do we mean by being loving in the workplace? So I talked about tenderness, which has a sort of sensitivity and a finesse of kindness and a willingness to offer sanctuary. And then in a different part of the dial, there's admiration, which has the quality of inspiration and the possibility of templating and learning and elevating oneself. And then if you turn the dial a little more, you get to the quality of hurt, which might have vulnerability and grief and the need for solace in it. And then if you turn it a little more, you get compassion, which has the desire to serve, and sensitivity to others' walks and how various people have been hurt in their lives. And each part of the dial has an important capability for leading in a transformational context, because people need to feel welcomed in all those dimensions, and I think mirrored and met in all those precious ways.
Yes. And there's something about mapping the field of love. What do we mean by it? It's sometimes an unhelpfully abstract conceptual virtue. And lots of people often want to know, but what does it look like in practice? If I'm being loving, or if I'm doing loving things, or if my coaching practice is loving, what am I saying, doing, being? So you're starting to map out some of that. What else would you include within being loving, particularly maybe as a coach? If I have a coaching practice that is perhaps observably loving or feels loving to my coaching client, what might that look like in practice?
One is a very deep capacity to abide at their rhythm. So I don't, out of my own need to feel important or to feel like I have an efficacy, ask somebody to move any faster than their defenses can integrate and metabolize. So I'm pacing to their pace. And that includes the speed of change. That includes the speed of intimacy and self-revelation. That includes the speed of the conversation. That includes the whole sort of perfume in which we meet. So can I leave my own rhythm and follow someone else's rhythm? When I'm training practitioners, we often do an exercise where in small groups, as I learned this from Thomas, each person takes a turn to dance in the center and the other coaches have to match the dancer. So you have to literally suspend your own habits of movement to move as they move. And that mirroring is a quality of reverence and nurturing and tending, I think. So that's one. I think the second is the real ability to suspend self-orientation and the noise of our mental chatter and to bring the highest quality of full attention to be a field of receptivity. Because a lot of the things people are communicating to us occur in small, nonverbal, paraverbal, and somatic signals. And if I am quiet enough in myself and my attention is sufficiently oriented to them, I pick up all of that. And their unconscious gets a signal that I'm really listening and that there aren't barriers to what they can bring to me. And that's a quality of loving receptivity, I think, is another quality. And the third one, which is maybe counterintuitive, is the willingness to be very candid. We often think of love as soft and fuzzy. It is kindness and tenderness for sure, but love also has ferocity and it also has trustworthiness. And if I'm going to be in high integrity with my client, I need to be the one who will take the risks to say the hard things to them. In particular, the things that are showing up in our field of relatedness that are cues to where they're getting stuck elsewhere. So the ability to use the live process between us as information that could be relevant to them about what's going on in their unconscious repertoires of behavior. I think that risk-taking, that boldness, that transparency, and that habit of mutual reflection is another expression of that love and intimacy. What would you add?
For me, currently, when I think of acts of love or lovingness in my coaching, I have a feeling that currently I do a lot of affirming and validating as a form of love. Some version of you're doing fine. It's not quite that you're perfect as you are, although it is that. But I see so many people coming to coaching or leadership development with fear that I'm not good enough. I'm not doing this right. I'm failing. I'm not competent. I'm not coping. So I think that the call for love for me in coaching at the moment is doing some version of, I suppose it's helping people self-regulate a little and self-soothe and find ways to let them know that the language is not deep enough, but they're okay.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I do think the skillfulness of helping people to downregulate their level of anxiety and fear is a really important theme right now. But you're saying something much deeper than just reassuring people or affirming people. I think what you're doing, Helena, in the beautiful description you just gave, is helping people who didn't get seen and welcomed and celebrated as children and started to validate themselves by what Thomas would call doing rights versus being rights. How can I contribute to the family? How can I achieve? How can I be perfect? How can I be good enough to earn love? And helping them move from that strategy, which has them on an endless hamster wheel of achievement and drive, to land back in what should have been their birthright, which is a state of self-blessing and self-sufficiency. And when you can be the person to redirect that habit of self-diminishment into a field of self-acceptance and self-abiding, I think that's a profound shift that you're sponsoring in that moment by the ways that you love and receive them. And I think there's a second thing you're doing, which is also a critically missing function in our culture, which is precisely mirroring their beauty. When we as coaches can pay attention to the subtle diamond that each executive is and mirror them in the particular facets of their gifts and their strengths and their inner qualities, we create a laboratory in which those things can start to have a wingspan that gets wider. Most people were mirrored in their childhood only to the degree that the parents were healed in their trauma. So most of us did not get seen in our enormity. We got seen in a very narrow subset of who we really are. And coaching, I think, can be a laboratory for experimentation and activation of a much wider dimensions of who we are. The other thing that came to me while you were speaking is something about the time commitment that we're making when we offer to work with someone. I have a marvelous energy teacher named Linda Cicera, and the first time I sat 10 days with her, she said the following sentence. She said, if somebody's sitting in a group that you're leading, they're there for a soul contract that you made with them, and you belong to them forever. And I started shaking because I knew it was true. And I knew that if I would treat every circle I lead as that kind of an eternal invitation, I would be trustworthy at a whole other level. And I have had the beautiful experience now of doing this for a long time, and that people who spend a week with me years later when they're in struggle, they reach for me. And I'm certain it's because that's what I'm holding in my heart, that this is a lifelong commitment I'm making, even if it looks like a week-long program. And people are longing to be held in that way and to be cherished over time and to have a safety net that they can count on. And I think all of us as practitioners have the opportunity to be that safety net over and over.
And if that isn't loving, I don't know what is. Some version of, I am here for you forever.
Yeah.
That is love.
That is love.
There are people listening, inevitably, who are not so sure about this love thing in business, in coaching, and maybe intrigued or wanting to faceplant and thinking, oh, I think I'm going to click off this podcast. And totally fair enough. There are lots of good reasons why we may have an allergic response to love. I wonder, what might you say to anyone listening, really, who's like, yeah, I'm not sure love has a place in coaching. I think I can do great work and not necessarily bring love into the picture. What's your response to that way of seeing things, I wonder?
In some ways, I would say I don't really have an agenda to persuade anybody. If you feel that you're getting the impact for your client that they're asking for and your coaching is going well and you can do it at a more tactical and behavioral level, then that's the nature of your offer and that's the nature of the exchange, and that's wonderful. What I'm pointing to is a possibility of something that starts to restore that person's life force and widen the aperture of what's possible in their leadership. I'm pointing to what I believe will help an organization to be a thriving ecosystem of creativity and productivity and generativity and contribution. And most of all, I'm pointing to what I hope would be beginning of an intervention on the level of interpersonal and geopolitical violence that's happening in our world. And if you're listening and thinking, I'm unhappy with any of those dimensions, my own degree to feel my life and to have access to my own passion and to feel inspired by my daily practice, my own ability to count on my team members to show up for me when I need help and to tell me when I'm not seeing, my ability of my organization to pulse with joy and collaborative tissue, my satisfaction with what's unfolding in world circumstances. If any of that feels dissatisfying to you, what I think our conversation points to is, how do we address all of that at its root? And I am certain that we can't restore or realign the fabric of all those different layers of systemic habit without going back for the gold that is buried in people's psyche. I've just seen it over and over. I'll give you an example. I had an executive in a program that I led, and he had been for 20 years told he was an extraordinary high performer, but the people on his team didn't feel his heart. They didn't feel valued by him, and therefore they didn't feel really galvanized to follow. He had coaching. He had gone to leadership programs. He had 360-degree feedback. He was very clear what his problem was. Nothing had really moved the needle. And what we uncovered in the week-long program that he came to is that when he was 11 years old, his brother had died. And essentially, when his brother died, the grief was so overwhelming and the family was so overwhelmed that they couldn't tend to it. He put his heart in a box and shut it down because the grief was literally too much to hold. And until he paused and had the time, the structure, and the holding to go back for that earlier grief and open the box and allow some of that to be expressed, felt, remembered, no amount of behavioral coaching was going to free that person. But once he did do that grief work, then the natural development of his heart is to express itself, is to be a waterfall, is to be loving every day to the people around him for whom he really cared. And I have thousands of stories like that, where the thing that people are stuck with requires a deeper solution.
Yes, and I often talk about how grief and love, in fact, Francis Weller says grief and love are sisters, they're siblings. And certainly grief work is love work. Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that is so meaningful is when executives on a team or executives across companies have a chance to share their life stories and the concurrent grief that accompanies those stories. They build a beautiful sense of connection, the universality of the human condition. Every story has grief. Every story has aspiration. Every story has moments of abandonment and isolation. Every story has aspects of grace and community. And we start to get wiser about what it is to walk as a leader and to hold others through the interstices of their life's unfolding. And as I said, the more my cup widens, the more people will bring me. So I start to hear stories spontaneously that otherwise nobody would have revealed to me.
Yeah. And love as connection, inviting execs, senior leaders to do personal storytelling work like that. It's not storytelling, personal story work. The number of times I've seen people move to tears at hearing their close colleague or distant colleague's personal story. The number of times I've seen people go up to other people and say, oh my gosh, me too. I was sent to boarding school at 8, or I was raised by a violent father, whatever it might be. And not only difficult stuff. And the connections that are formed in those moments are so precious and so deep and so lasting.
Yeah, it's gorgeous what you said. And all of those are very vivid and correct examples. We start to see our reflection in other people's stories, and that's an incredibly meaningful thing. And those two people having found that bond, you don't have to do an exercise to teach them how to trust each other or have each other's back. That becomes the natural expression of that bond. And so that's why I think you can't overstate the impact of this kind of intimate repair work happening with groups of colleagues and breaking down the historic barriers that differentiate the personal and the professional, that bifurcate it so much that I could work next to somebody for 20 years and not know they have an autistic son and not know what help to offer, or they have a parent in a nursing home. We're living in such unnecessary isolation from each other's actual relational needs. And then we don't get to experience ourselves as generous. We don't get to experience our lives as interwoven and interdependent. Business puts such an emphasis on autonomy and quote, resilience. Resilience means I don't need anybody. It's completely antithetical to how life is wired.
And increasingly, I think sometimes we coach in isolation. We coach the individual around their tasks or their role or within their organization. And I think, clearly, I'm not speaking for everyone here, that we don't bring the widest context in enough. And if I think the most neutral phrase is something like the way the world is going at the moment. That's probably the most neutral I can be. It feels to me that love, however we bracket that, love matters more than ever. It's not optional. And I wonder what you were thinking, feeling, experiencing, seeing in why love might matter now more than ever.
There's some language happening in our field of practice where people are suggesting we're moving from a world of complexity to a world of chaos, or from a VUCA world to what they're calling a BANI world. And BANI is brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. So if that's true, or if that's illustrative of the dynamics that are happening, we know that people are going to have a demand to be fluid in a way that has never been needed before. And that inner fluidity requires a sense of ground and centeredness on the one hand, because I have to stabilize myself inside structures that are shaking. It requires a kind of inner spaciousness because I need my intuition to make sense of what's happening. I can't simply rely on data and intellectual discourse to show me a complex picture that's constantly shifting and changing and churning. And I need other people in order to even see the intricacy of a complex picture, because even to be in reality of what is the challenge we're facing, I need other voices, other parts of the system. I need other points of view and perspective just to describe what is, let alone what could be. And so this quality of collaboration and generosity and mutual dialogue and collective intelligence, it's a business imperative now. And what has been my experience is that creating deeper trust, deeper intimacy, more vulnerability, more authenticity, and more love inside of a company, inside of a team, is the turbocharge to all those transformational capabilities. I do believe it's no longer a nice to have. I think it's going to become more and more a business imperative. And I'm not particularly attached to us calling it love. We could call it caring. We could call it trust. We could call it collective intelligence. We could call it teaming. The language doesn't so much matter, but the radical quality of unbounded co-commitment, that's what we're going for.
Which reminds me too that I think I've heard you speak and really advocate for this work that we're talking about, not just being done one-to-one in therapy, for example, but being done collectively.
Yeah.
That we need to do this work together, explicitly together. Can you speak to that? Because again, that's quite radical. Usually this work is done in private in a consulting practice room.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would do is just to really honor how important the private and dyadic work is. And even in my group programs, each executive steps out and does do a private one-on-one session with one of my transformational coaches who are trauma trained. So I believe very much in the sanctity of that dialogue. And at the same time, I think the age of the privatization of pain is over. these are hurts that have happened across generations of violence in our world culture, and they can only be healed in the collective. And I think it's absolutely critical that we come together in companies to do this healing work, in ritual and culture to do this healing work. I'm very inspired by Thomas Hübel's work to work on the aftermath of World War II in Germany with descendants of Nazi soldiers and descendants of Holocaust survivors in 1,000-person groups of collective trauma process. I think that's right. We need acupuncture points of repair and restoration where we all come together across boundaries and across points of pain and start to heal the polarization and division that is shaping our life. And so I do believe very much, Helena, as you said, that it's a moment where doing this together, it helps people not to feel isolated in the level of hurt they walk with. It immediately gives people an exhale to realize other people are also afraid. Other people are also numbing themselves. Other people are also struggling. Just the universality of that admission is already a step towards the repair. And so I think there are things that can only happen in a group setting. And I think this is the time, as they say in the Talmud, if not now, when? And if not us, who?
We're coming to the last 5 minutes or so of our time, Amy, and I'm wondering what you're wishing I had asked you. What do you think? Why she didn't go there? I would love to have spoken to this. What feels really important to say about love in coaching and in business that you'd really love to speak to?
What a generous question. Maybe this last point that I just made about that the repair has to happen in groups, also, I would want to apply that to us as practitioners. I think it's very important not to feel isolated in our own journeys, not trying to be expert at everything, to be able to say in front of a group of peers, I'm also struggling. I also need help. I also get scared. I'm also at my edge. And so whether that gets done in supervision groups or workshops or by joining a network like Mobius and being part of a community of learners and practitioners, I think it's really important, especially as you said, for coaches who are so often working one-on-one, to themselves feel like they have a community of practice that can support them and hold them in their process, and that we have places to do our own work and support each other in our own healing journey. That to me is as vital as what we're doing for clients. So maybe just to say this quality of love is something you have to bring to your own life. Put the oxygen mask on yourself first. Make sure you have impeccable practices of self-care and self-nurturing, and be very kind and involved in each other's journey.
Thank you. Lovely. This has been full of gifts for me. Thank you so much. And I think one of the things I'm taking away is something about the quality of the language you use and your exquisite attention to language here. It's really beautiful. Thank you. And I also know that people will be Googling furiously to find out more of where you've written, which podcasts you're on, how to hear you speak. So obviously, Mobius Executive Leadership is one of your websites, but I wonder if you'd say something about where you would point people to contact you, find out more about you.
Well, I would be wonderfully delighted to hear from people. The Next Practice Institute that I mentioned, our professional development arm, runs workshops very regularly for practitioners, and you can find it, as Helena said, on the Mobius website. And if you want to hear earlier podcasts or read my LinkedIn writings, those can be found on my website, which is amyelizabethfox.com. And it would be only a delight to share them with everyone. And let me just also add, Helena, a deep expression of gratitude for the visionary contribution you're making by engaging these dialogues on love in our field and opening the door of this being a legitimate and important professional conversation. At this time, it touches me profoundly, and I am very grateful, as I know everyone listening is.
Thank you. I will take that, and also really want to bow to your pioneering work that you're doing. Beautiful and extraordinary and important.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll speak again soon.
Wonderful.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, to advance the coaching profession, and to make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. There you can explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools and models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.